It's so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me, man.
Glad to be here, man. It's an honor.
Okay. First order of business. We got to know how to pronounce your last name.
All right. It's intimidating until you look at it and break it down bit by bit. So it's Onwuchekwa.
Oh, yeah.
Onwuchekwa. Yeah.
It's
exactly
easy. The way it looks. It's easy. Onwuchekwa.
This is what I'm saying. Once it's done, it's easy.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, I know that I know a little bit about your story, and I know we were just kind of chatting right beforehand, a little bit of my story. And this is a conversation that neither one of us would have wanted to have. We wouldn't have wanted to meet under these conditions.
Right.
And yet there's something beautiful and redemptive about, as we experience loss, how we can help other people in that. Scripture says that God comforts us so that we can, with the same comfort other people. And
absolutely.
And so, man, I'm just thrilled and honored that you'd be willing to sit down and share a painful part of your story for the benefit of other people.
Yeah.
So
no. I feel it. I mean, in the course of these past few years, I think one of the things that I've learned is, we've always heard like misery loves company, and it was put in a bad sense. Like, people that are mad love to be around people that are mad. But I think in the course of these past few years, I found misery needs company, right? Like, we actually need other people to sit with us in our grief and to remind us that it's not abnormal, right? That it is a very normal part of life. It doesn't make us less than the thoughts that we have when grief comes up. It doesn't make us, horrible people. It makes us human. And there's something about sharing our humanity in grief that frees us to be honest with one another and God. And that honesty helps us to really engage with God in a deeper sense.
Yeah. Wow. That's so good. That's so good. There's a Jewish practice in ancient Judaism called the sitting Shiva, right? And I always have to be very careful when I say that, sitting Shiva, make sure I don't mention words. But that's what it was all about. It was about if someone was experiencing grief, you just go and sit with them and be present and just weep with them,
Right. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I think that's so imperative. I think we've lost that in our culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I know you're a pastor, and I know that you're helping people in so many different respects, but I think even as pastors, we struggle to create cultures in our churches and in our spiritual communities where it's okay to acknowledge the brokenness and humanity, the grief that's part of humanity. We want to whitewash it so often,
Yeah. Until you go through it and then you find out, I can't put up the veneer. I just don't have the strength to. And then it's crazy. Like, it's so counterintuitive when when that thin veneer of being put together crumbles and the roots are exposed. That's actually the thing that endears us to people, and people finally look at us and feel the permission themselves to be human.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so good. Well, man, we're going to talk quite a bit about the loss of your brother, Sam.
Yeah.
And before we do that, I'd love for our listeners just to get to know you a little bit. What do you, tell us about your family, what you do and where you're from.
All right. Yeah. So John Onwuchekwa, born and raised in Houston, Texas, to a pair of Nigerian immigrants that came over about 50 years ago. Dad is a pastor. Mom got her doctorate in education when she was working full time, raising 5 kids. So that's the kind of family that I grew up with. Went to college at Baylor, master's at Dallas Theological, pursuing a doctorate at Emory right now. And I live in the West End. Been married to my beautiful wife, Chandra, for, it'll be 15 years for us this fall. Wow. So I turned 38 here in the next month, and 15 years. We've got a beautiful 5-year-old daughter, Ava, and she's great. We bought her a dog for Christmas, a miniature poodle named Pretzel. And nobody told me that when you buy a 4-year-old a dog, you really buy yourself a dog. So I bought myself a miniature poodle that my daughter got to name. So that's our family.
That's
We live in
amazing.
the historic West End.
Mm.
When it comes to what I do, I think the word that I use now is and. So for
Mm.
14 years, 13 and a half years, I was a full-time pastor.
Yeah.
And then when I started to write, then I was like, oh, pastor and author. Before the pandemic, me and a group of folks set out to start a coffee company aimed at trying to
Cool.
bring dignity and restoration to the West End. So I'm an entrepreneur, and we own Portrait Coffee here in the West End, which a couple weeks ago, Food and Wine did a list of the top 50 roasters in the U.S. by state, and Portrait Coffee
Get
in
out
the
of here.
hood of the West End made that
Wow.
list. Yeah, so yeah, it's been crazy, and
Wow.
so yeah, so now I pastor a church. I write. I work with a church planning network called the Creek Collective, where we aim to help plant churches in distressed and neglected communities of
Wow.
color. And so I get a chance just to tell stories, create content, and
Wow.
yeah, be. So, and those are all the things that I do.
Man, that's incredible. That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's funny. You know,
It's-
I had a crisis like that a few years ago where I stepped away from being a full-time local church pastor and
right.
started doing the ministry that we're doing right now. And it's the
Yeah.
same thing. People ask me, what do
Yeah.
I do? And I'm like, I don't know, to be honest with
Yeah.
you.
Right. Yeah.
I just, maybe I just try to be.
Yeah.
You know?
And tell stories. So I think that's the thread that I found that weaves it all, right? It's
Yeah.
what we do, right? So for so long, we
Mm.
told the greatest story ever told in a direct, explicit sense to a group of people each week. And now we get a chance to do that and show how that great story intersects with
Wow.
lives of people who don't want or don't think they want a direct connection to God. We just show them, oh, listen, there's an intersection. God wants
Yeah.
to intersect in your life.
Man,
Yeah.
that's great. Wow. That's so
Yeah.
great. Well, you
Yeah.
know, I know a lot of those transitions happen in our life, maybe not as a
Right.
direct result of tragedy that we experience, but a lot
Oh,
of times
yeah.
we have those existential crises where we go,
Yeah.
what exactly, what am I doing? You know, and like, what's the
Right.
purpose out of this? I know you've wrestled with that yourself. Why don't you kind
Mm.
of jump back into your story and tell us a little bit about the loss of your brother and the
Yeah.
impact that has had on you?
Yeah. So this was, let me see, this was April 2015. So 2 months before we planted the church that I pastor right now, 7 years ago.
Mm.
My wife and I had experienced infertility for the first 8 years of our marriage, unexplained. And so wanted to have kids and couldn't. Well, it seemed like our friends were like, they had kids like every 6 weeks and they didn't even want them, right? So
Right.
we were on vacation preparing to meet a baby girl that we tried to adopt for over a year. And on April the 10th, they reached out to us and they said, I'm sorry, it's a no-go. Y'all aren't going to be able to adopt her. So we drive home, sad, heartbroken. I get on a plane April 14th, 2015, and I go to a conference where a friend of mine is preaching on heaven. I heard one message at the conference that I was supposed to speak at, and he preached on 1 Thessalonians 4, how we don't grieve as those who grieve when we lose loved ones because we have hope. That night at dinner, we're sitting at a steakhouse and I get a phone call from my mom. And, you know, I ignore it because it's like, that's just my mom. She'll call back. Well, she keeps on calling. So I take the phone from her and or I take the call from her. She's like, hey, we're having problems tracking down your bigger brother. Can you just call around and find him? And, you know, a few calls later, I'm on the phone with my god brother. And I think I heard him say, "Oh, Sam passed out." And it's like, "Yo, he passed out. Is he okay?" And he's like, "No, no, no. Sam passed away."
Oh, wow.
And it was right. And you know, like when you get that news, it's just surreal. It's like, nah, no, like what? And I just remember breaking down outside of the steakhouse, just being like, Sam's dead, Sam's dead. And it's funny the things you remember. Like, I remember the faces of the people that were out there that I'll never see again. I remember, like, not just that my knees were shaking, but how they shook. And it was just like, rented a car, and my, co-pastor, one of my best friends, Richard, drove me home from Orlando to Atlanta. And I was just sitting with the fact of, he's gone. He's gone. And I feel like, Davey, like, that was, him being gone was the second biggest surprise in my life. The first biggest surprise in my life was how quickly my faith crumbled in the weeks to come, right? That it's, C.S. Lewis, when he talked about, in Grief Observed, he talks about the death of his wife. And one of the things that he says is that we imagine our faith to be a temple. But what grief does is it shows us that it's nothing more than a house of cards, and just how quickly it could fall. Right. And that shocked me, right? Here I am 6 weeks away from planting this church. And now grief made me feel like a liar. It made me feel like everything I spent my whole life talking to people about the goodness of God, I don't just not believe it, but now I'm grieving the fact that I ever spent my time trying to convince people that was true. And my life was just a whirlwind. I mean, and we'll talk more, but it was like, everything, I felt like it came crumbling down. And to this day, it's here's the thing about grief, David, right? Like, people that have gone through this, people that are listening to this podcast, and they are transported back and they say, oh, I know how you feel. Like, man, how you do this each week. And it's like, so, I mean, I lost my brother and you lost your wife close to the same time. Like, it's crazy how you can just be transported back. And you're reminded, like, grief doesn't have an expiration date, right? Yeah. Most people on the front end tend to think that it's like a loaf of bread, that it's fresh. And then as time goes on, it'll just kind of mold, crumble, and go away. But grief is like the non-perishable can of greens at the back of the pantry. It could sit around for 50 years, but something can crack it open, and it feels just as fresh as it did the day that it, took place. So my life, it wasn't just shaped by that, right? It still is today very much being shaped by the loss of Sam. Yeah.
That phrase, grief made me feel like a liar. I mean, that's powerful, man. I mean, that's very, very poignant, because I feel like all of us who have experienced grief, who had a faith foundation prior to it, we can resonate with that. We can say, oh, I know exactly what you mean, because this thing that happened to me it shook me at the core. And it confronted my belief system, saying, do I really buy into what I'm saying I buy in now, especially as pastors who, like what you said, we are trying to convince people to buy into this thing. Right. Now you're confronted with this. Wow. I don't even know if I believe it.
Right.
If you can remember, what were some of those things? Like, can you parse it down to specific questions that began to arise in your head that caused your faith to feel very fragile, if not completely upended? What were some questions or doubts about God that, because I'm sure that there are people who are listening to this, that they're in that place right now and they're going, it's the same thing I feel. Can you identify some of those things?
Yeah. So I think one of the most fundamental ones was, the wisdom of God. Is God really as wise as he says that he is, right? So I think sometimes the danger of even engaging with stuff like this on the front end of your is you spend time trying to look with insight and figure out what God's trying to teach you right now. And oftentimes it's a mystery, right? So it's like I would sit back and be like, yo, God, what are you doing? Are you trying to teach me humility? There's a million ways that you could teach me that without taking my brother. Yo, are you trying to teach me patience? I know I lose my cool some, but there's a million ways that you could have done it. And you really get to a sense where it's like the questions of why God, which is a question that's wet cement, kind of forms and firms into a how could you, God, which is more of an indictment than a question. Wow. And it's like, yo, you can't be as wise as you think that you are, because any virtue that you were trying to produce in my life, I could rattle off if God, if you would have brought me in on this and we could have whiteboarded, I could have given you 10 ways that you could have made this better. Right. And so the big thing was the wisdom of God and just not confident that he was as wise as he claimed to be.
Man, that why God being the wet cement that ends up firming into concrete that says, how could you, God? That's so good. Because we'll tell people a lot, John, it's almost imperative that you start with that question, why? Because you're gonna go there, right? That's one of the first places you're gonna go. You look at it, you see it in the story of Job, why?
Yeah.
And yet, even though it's an imperative phase for us to go to, you have to move through why and begin to ask other questions, right? If you're not moving in the right direction, which we can talk about in a second, right? And how that begins to catalyze in your life, actual healing and comfort and trust again in the Lord, catalyzing you. If you're not moving in that direction, then you can move in the direction of exactly what you said. How could you? Which becomes this indictment. And that's not to say that God can't take that, right, and move that into the right direction as well. That's absolutely true. He can, and he does, and he will. But I think that's a really insightful thing I had not thought about before, John, where it just moves into this how could you question really quickly.
Yeah. And then as soon as we start to indict, when you're indicting somebody, you're not inquisitive, right? So you're not really trying to understand, you're trying to accuse and prove, no, I was right with the accusation that I made. And now it becomes a war and an attack and a fight and not a wrestle, right? So it's one thing
I was just going to say that. It's like that's so interesting, right? It's like you're either attacking or you're wrestling. And they seem two very similar things, but they're not.
Right. No. One is I'm trying to beat you into submission. One is it's all right. No. Your God hope seems slippery here. And I'm just trying to wrestle. I'm just trying to hold on, right? I'm just trying to find my firm footing, right? I'm not trying to step on your throat. And that's the hard thing. And one of the things that I would say is that I just want folks to know it was as a pastor, right? And somebody who spends their life studying the scriptures and knowing what I should do and shouldn't do. I spent so much of my time condemning myself for the way that I felt instead of exploring why I felt the way that I felt, right?
So good.
And so it's saying I'd be mad and I'd say, yo, angry. I shouldn't be mad at God. All right, I'm going to wrestle my anger into submission and God, I'm not mad. And it's like, no. I was pretending. I was angry. And if I would have just spent time and explored that and kind of leaned into it and went into it, I would have been reminded that grief is something to go through. Grief kind of feels like this fog, right? And if you've ever been at a place where there's a thick fog, sometimes the fog can feel so thick that it looks solid and you think you've got to go around it. But the thing about fog is it looks solid, but you can go through it. And even if you can't see your way through, it doesn't mean that you can't make your way through. And that's, yeah, great. Just being able to have somebody to hold you by the hand and, walk you through that.
Wow. Wow. That's so good. We often say that our emotions that we are experiencing, no matter how extreme or negative they are, they're invitations from God
Oh,
to step
absolutely.
into deeper healing. They're not something for us to suppress or knock down or escape or kind of box up, but there's a reason we're experiencing those emotions.
Right.
And and these are things that God's using as a thread. Like if we pull the thread on those emotions, we'll find God.
Right. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely, man.
Here's what's interesting to me, John. We talk with people about all different types of pain, different avenues of pain, everywhere from childhood trauma to, abortion, regret and recovery to divorce but we, because of my story and the way that this podcast started, we have a lot of people on who talk about loss, but mostly it's loss of a spouse or loss of a child. And if we're honest, those two kind of avenues seem to be the ones that get the most attention when loss happens.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The focus kind of goes on, okay, who was the spouse of that person?
Right.
Or if it's a parent that's lost a child, right? They go, they kind of go to that. But very rarely is there like a sibling focus or emphasis. And that's a unique type of pain, because here is somebody who has shared your upbringing, your origin. They are a part of who you are so inextricably. They, no matter what your relationship is like with your sibling, there is a part of all those memories of your family of origin that you share with somebody else here on this earth now seem like they are gone. And this doesn't get brought into the focal point very often. I wonder if you can help us and enlighten us to maybe some of the uniqueness of sibling loss, because there's so many people that I know and who are listening to this that's how they experience what they've experienced, but they don't feel like people understand the position or station they sit at right now.
Yeah. So here's one thing. It's like, so me and my wife have been married for 15 years. And so it's like, I've lived my adult life with her by my side. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I tried to remember what life was like without her. Mm-hmm. And it's hard, but then my friends come around and we sit and talk and it's like, oh yeah, I had a life without her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
With my siblings, that's not the case, right? It's when I lost my brother, it's like, oh, no. I've never known life in this world without him. So he goes farther back than anything else, right? And it's not just that. It's part of what makes it all hard too is, this is the thing. It's like when I lost my brother, most people think that loss makes you want to draw closer to the rest of the people that you're there. But it does something unique in this. I lost my brother, and he was actually the closest sibling that I had. And his loss didn't draw me closer to the rest of my family. It made me distance from them, right? Because what I instinctively did was I said, man, if it hurt this bad to lose him, and I was closer to him than anybody else, then it's going to hurt. Like, why would I increase the bonds of relationship with them and make it harder to lose them? And so what I was trying to do was I was trying to protect myself from future grief, but all I did was rob myself of present joy, right? But you just see how easy it is to justify that. And now the very people that God has put in your life as tools to help you work through that grief, you push them away and you get angry and you fight, and the most unbreakable bonds now collapse, and it just makes life so complicated, right? And so I think, that's something that's unique. And then you just find yourself in a place where like life gets so complicated, and that my brother had 3 kids. Or he has 3 kids. They were 5, 3, and 1 when when he passed. Last time I saw him, they were 6, 4, and 2. It's been 6 years since I've seen them. So they're 12. And I haven't seen them for lack of wanting to. It's that grief does crazy things to all of us. And now you have these relationships with family that are strained, and it just makes it, incredibly hard. And then everything that, right, you think about, like all your hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
There's just so many other intersection points that causes grief to come back up. Me and my brother played ball our whole life. We talked about Steph Curry, what things would look like when he got into the league. 2015 is the rise of this era of basketball, and I can't share it with him. He's walked through my whole journey with infertility. And now when we adopt our daughter, and it's crazy, when we adopt our daughter, 2 years to the date, like she was born premature. She was on a breathing machine. 2 years to the date that my brother took his last breath, they took her off her breathing machine, right? And it's like, I can't share that with him. And you just see how much of life is really, man, it's just so, tough.
It just makes you, there's so many emotions that you feel, even as you're explaining this, there's so many emotions I'm feeling, on your path. But one of those emotions is it makes me angry, right? It makes me really frustrated at the enemy, at the fallen, broken nature of this world. The fact that the enemy would leverage this kind of pain, this kind of loss and grief that's part of our humanity, and he would use it to cause even more destruction in relationships and in, wherever you're at, whatever context, whatever is around you, wherever you go, it can breed this really complicated, messy thing.
Yeah.
And it makes me frustrated. There's a holy discontent there,
Oh man. Yeah.
And I know it does the same for you, right? As you're thinking like, why? What? Like, not only is there this loss of this person I love, but all of these other ancillary subsequent losses that ensue because of it.
I know.
And it's like, when is this going to be made right?
Right. Yeah. That's it. Those are the things that you sit with.
John, I wonder, if you can track for us a little bit of, you've talked a little bit about how your world just kind of got upended and you started wrestling with all these emotions that made you feel like a liar, made you feel like that you no longer believed what you were trying to convince everybody else to believe. And I know it wasn't overnight, because it's not usually overnight for any of us, right? We want God to heal in poof, he heals in process, is what we always say.
Right.
I wonder if you could help us understand a little bit of that process and that journey. When did you begin to go, wait, God, like, okay, I'm beginning to believe in your goodness again. I'm beginning to, because I'm assuming that you wouldn't be doing what you're doing right now if that weren't the case, right? You have now been, in some ways, the goodness of God has been restored into you, probably even more so now on this side.
Oh, let me tell you. Yeah. Oh, it's right. The holes that were dug up in my faith weren't purposeless, right? It's I live in Atlanta, and they're building tons of buildings there. And so there were these there's these places in the ground where the hills are, or the ground isn't, level. And so I see them, and they have this picture of this big building that they're getting ready to put in. And their first step is digging out that hole. And you can think like, no, wait a minute. Y'all are supposed to build a building you're going backwards.
Yeah.
You're creating a deeper hole. And they're like, no. Unless we create that hole, we're not going to be able to put a strong enough foundation to hold it. And that's what I saw that God did. So over the course of the next year, my life spiraled out of control. So you talk about a raging optimist for 30 years of his life, being severely depressed to the point where I knew something was wrong when I didn't get a parking spot. And I rolled down my window and I cussed out the people that took my parking spot on purpose. And I think like, yo, what's happening?
Yeah.
And so I called my wife, called my best friend Trip, called Richard, and I just tell them, and they don't scold me. They're like, yeah, it's okay. Let's walk through this. So then my church granted me a sabbatical about a year later. And so I have a month where I don't have anything to do. And this is the crazy thing. It was actually the book of Ecclesiastes that helped to lift me up out of my sorrow, right? Where, all right, look, I was like, yo, life is meaningless. I hate it here. And I felt that way because I lost it all. Well, then you pick up this book and you read it, and there's a guy that says, yo, meaningless. And you're like, yo, wait a minute. I know I'm here because I lost it all, but there's somebody else that made their way to the same destination, but they had it all. Wait a minute. If we're both here and we have different circumstances, maybe I was wrong in feeling like my joy was tied to circumstances. Maybe there's another way. And that was the thing that made me start to think, all right, wait. Maybe there is a way to gain hope even when things feel hopeless. Maybe hope is not as distant as I thought. And so it was reading through that book, being in counseling, being surrounded by people that helped me walk through it and help me see, they helped me see the transparency of grief. Grief feels like a thick fog. It feels opaque, like you can't go through. And somebody just holds your hands and walks you through and says, no, you can walk through. And it was feeling the permission to be honest with God about where I was and realizing that God didn't scold me. God understood. And I remember being in the pulpit and like just breaking down and weeping and all of these times. And the people that were in our church were just so gracious. And it was crazy because I've been pastoring since I was 22, and here I am 31, like crying and snotting in the pulpit. And it's the first time that I really felt that my worth or my value to people was wasn't tied to my usefulness to them, right? Wow. And that was the thing that made me feel like, oh God, maybe there's something here. And it was just Ecclesiastes, that book, just the sobriety that comes in the fact of nothing in life is going to be everything that we hoped that it would be, right? That's what life is like. And once you grab onto that truth, then you find yourself, learning to live the life of your dreams by enjoying the life that you have, right? Not like trying to escape the bitterness, but starting to lean in to it. And you notice some of the subtle sweetnesses that God has left behind.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, that's rich, bro.
Yeah.
That's like, when you begin to, I think I really resonate with that, even that one notion right there of my value was no longer tied to my usefulness to people.
Right.
And I think, and maybe it's because we're both pastors or,
right.
we have been, or we are, whatever, we help people.
Right.
That's what we're,
right.
And so we tend to adopt our identity begins to get so tethered to this idea of like, well, people love me because I help them and because I
Right.
bring them insight. I bring them something
Right.
fresh that they walk out of, when I preach, they feel inspired. And so they come back and
Right.
that's why they love me. And so, but you're explaining how you were met with this community of people that saw you at your worst, at your ugliest, and they still loved you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what
and they
began
helped
to
me
unravel that for you and go, wait.
Absolutely. Oh, wait, like I don't have to be anybody's hero or savior. I can just be a human and ordinary. And I was reminded, no, I can be one of the sheep here at the church. Like I don't have to be the chief shepherd. And it just, it changes you, right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Did you find that, was it tempting in that process to get pulled back into like almost dismissing or putting aside your own grief that you need to work through to help other people work through their own, their mess or whatever's going on in their life and stuff? Like, were you, did it feel like a tug of war sometimes?
So when we started our church, we found ourselves in a unique space where it was a young church full of 30 somethings. In those first few months, everybody lost somebody. So one of our good friends lost his sister to cancer the month after Sam lost. One of my best friend's wife lost her grandfather. The day that the church launched, June 7th, it was great. Lots of people. And then we get a call that night that my wife loses her grandmother. And on and on and on. It was like that for like 3 weeks. So, or every 3 weeks, something would take place until January of the next year. We buried a church member that we baptized on the same day my mother-in-law was baptized. And it was this thing that made us really that since so much grief came through, it was hard, but there was no time to pretend. And so I feel like that the Lord like knitted our hearts together, but the Lord also like so uniquely used that time just to birth in us this. And I think this is one of the biggest truths that helped me out is we stopped trying to, in the moment, gain insight on what God was doing through grief, right? And here's what I mean. We tend so much to try to use our insight, right? To try to make sense of what God's trying to do in the world.
Right.
When instead we should be using our hindsight, right? So it's like this.
Wow.
Like God works in mysterious ways and we're not detectives. So we're not going to figure out what God is doing. Ecclesiastes 3 going to say, oh, there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to want, and it's going to give these lists. We so desperately want to choose what side of the list that we're on, but you find out you can't choose.
Yeah.
And then he goes on and says, God has put eternity on their hearts so that nobody will know what comes after them. And it's this way of saying, no, look. Instead of working on your insight, you need to work on your hindsight, right? Wow. You need to look behind you and you need to be reminded that if God doesn't change, that his past acts of faithfulness aren't like an album of his greatest hits. His past acts of faithfulness are really a future promise to remind us of the good that he would do. So it was at those points that we would just hold on to the promises of God. I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know what good you're going to bring out of this, but I know this is what you do. All right. From the beginning of the world.
Yeah. Right.
You said things were dark and you spoke by the power of your word, and it was your business to bring beauty out of chaos. Nobody coerced you. All right, we trust that you're going to do it. And I just pray that you would sustain me in the meantime. Don't let me fall away. don't let me trip too bad, God. And it was when we started to hold on to the promises of God, we realized that it's like, oh, no, this is the case. All of God's people, every one of God's people goes through seasons of doubt where what God says doesn't line up with who he is. And it was focusing on who God was in the past was the thing that drew our affections closer to him more than trying to find out what he was trying to do in the process.
Wow. Bro, that is amazing. Insight. We try to go insight and we need to look at hindsight. And that's so true, right? Like, I mean, we're not going to be able to predict what's happening in our future.
No way.
And yet there's something really interesting about the fact that God works. It seems like God works in cycles. He works in patterns. He works in rhythms, right? And so we can trust those rhythms and those patterns because we see those laid out throughout history and throughout throughout the scripture, right? And throughout his faithfulness. And so we can trust in those, in the goodness and the faithfulness of God. And yet we cannot predict where we are in that cycle or where we are in that pattern, or where we are in that. Man, that's so interesting. And I think I'm like dumbstruck by it right now because I'm reading a couple of, I hate the word like secular and sacred, but I'm reading some like secular books right now on like market cycles and trends and, all of these things of, the changing of world order and all this stuff. And it's like people are trying to predict where we are as a nation on the curve of our existence. And, and it's like, okay, I see where you're going. You're taking all of this data from the past and you're using that to try to, presuppose where we are in that cycle and what's to come. But the truth is we just don't know.
We don't know.
All that data is helpful, right? It helps us to see these trends. We just don't know where we are.
We don't.
Wow.
And it's like this, right? So it's like this, right? I tell you something. I love tuna fish sandwiches. Love tuna fish. I didn't know how it was made until we got married. So here I am. I love tuna fish. I hate mayo. So my wife is in the kitchen one day and I see her about to put the mayo in the tuna. I say, yo, what are you doing? Like, stop. I hate that stuff. And she's like, no, John, look. All right. You don't know how this is made. So I want you to know. Mayo, you hate it, but you hate it by itself.
Right.
When I mix this in with this, it creates the dish that you love. Something that you hate is necessary to produce what you love. And if you would just trust me and let me cook, when you get the finished product, then I think you'll enjoy it. Our problem is we stand over God's shoulder and we try to judge his goodness while he's working. And it's saying, no, you're on insight. Let him finish. Once he's done, then judge if he's good or not. But you can't judge his canvas before he's done painting. And it's that reality that gives us the ability to just like, all right, I'm gonna sit. All right. Listen, my act of faith, it's not saying that I got to have a smile on my face. It's saying, all right, I'm going to sit, God. I'm going to sit and wait, and we'll see if you really do what you say that you would do. And I think that it's like 7 years later, right? It's like you even look at what's going on now, and it's like, with you, and nothing is wasted. You wouldn't or couldn't have charted out this course for your life. You couldn't have written that story, right? I could never have written a story of April 10th, we would have a failed adoption. April the 14th, my daughter would take her unassisted brat we never could have written April 10th, failed adoption. April 14th, Sam takes his last breath. 2 years later, April 10th, we get a call that we can adopt our baby girl. April 14th, on Good Friday, reflecting on the day that Sam died, I'm reading her a chapter of J.I. Packer's book on adoption. As she's an infant, the doctor whisks her out of my arms. And before I protest, he says, today's the day that she's going to breathe on her own. She takes her first breath the day that Sam took his last breath, the day that our Savior took his last breath, en route to us waiting for a few days for him to breathe again and promise that his resurrection is not just one of a kind, but it's the first of its kind. And now I'm reminded of that story as tears are flowing down my cheeks, and tears of sorrow and tears of joy, not knowing which one is which because they taste the same, but being reminded that God's going to wipe them all away right at some point in time. But we could never write about the goodness of God that way. Right. And, but we've got to let him cook. We got to let him finish. And it's hard and it feels impossible, but the people in our lives help us see it's not impossible. And they hold us up when we can't hold ourselves up.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, it's Ecclesiastes. It says he makes all things beautiful in his time.
In his time.
And that sounds so cliche, man. What a wonderful coffee cup verse, but it is true. It is true.
Absolutely.
The hard reality of that is leaning into in his time.
Yeah.
It's not our time. It's not our time. That's why, man, John, that's what I love about the psalmist says, Psalm 23 at the end, verse 6 says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me. All the days of my life. And I started thinking, I was preaching about that one time, and and it was in the midst of my grief, and I'm going, I don't feel it, God. I don't feel that goodness and mercy are following me right now. And the Lord nudged me. He said, this was in the middle of a sermon. You know how this happens, right? In the middle of a sermon.
Right.
And everybody's like, is he okay? Like, gets real awkward for a moment. The Lord nudged me right in the middle of the sermon. He said, Davey, you don't know something's following you until you look back.
There we go. There we go.
Well, talk to me about this, John. You just said it. Nobody could write this story the way that God writes the story.
Yeah.
There have been probably some things that have, diverged in your story because of this wrestling that you went through.
Yeah.
There's some things where you're like, man, I would have thought my life, I would have been going down this path at this point, pursuing this purpose, this mission, doing this thing. But because of this really pivotal thing that took place in my life and the wrestlings with the Lord and the fruit that was birthed out of that, this is what I'm doing now. Pain to purpose, right? What kind of purpose right now are you experiencing solely because of what you've walked through?
So my life right now, it's shaped me, and I realize the power of story. And so it's like this, right? So I just wrote a book, We Go On, Finding Purpose in All of Life's Joys and Sorrows. And the aim of that book. By the way,
we're going to give away a copy of that. So make sure you follow Nothing is Wasted Ministries on Instagram to get your copy of John's book.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, so the goal of it was really birthed out of this, right? Tragedy hits and we don't feel like we can go on. We know that life goes on, but we feel like we can't. And kind of this was the thing that like crystallized for me. People tend to look at tragic endings like a death sentence. And I found out that my role, or what I want to do in life, is I want to change the punctuation. I want to erase the period, and I want to put in a comma or a semicolon and say, no. This story goes on, right?
Yeah.
For the past 4 years now, I wake up every morning at 4 a.m. It's great when I'm on the East Coast. I'm in Phoenix right now. And so I've been up since, 1:30 this time. But, here's the beautiful thing about 4 a.m. Is it looks like midnight. It looks like it's pitch black and dark. The only thing that tells me that it's a new day is the clock. And so when I wake up at 4 a.m., I've either got to trust my surroundings, how I feel, or I have to trust what the clock says, right? If I trust what the clock says, then I can rise and get up and get to work and wait on my circumstances to catch up. It's this daily act of hopeful defiance that reminds me the state of my soul doesn't have to be affected by the state of my surroundings, right? My joy doesn't have to be tethered. My circumstances aren't elevator buttons. Good ones don't make me go up, bad ones don't make me go down. And I feel like now it's helped me see, it's like, no, this is what I'm meant to do. That I think so many people have gone through so many various kinds of grief. Right. And what I'm not trying to do is jump in and say, I know exactly how you feel, do this, do this. Yeah. But there's something powerful about even what we do, and just telling our story, talking in a way where eavesdroppers are welcome and they can drop in and they say, you gave me words to what I felt. You've provided me with what I need to be able to take this next step. And I just really, this was the thing that helped me see, honesty and hope. Most people think they're parallel streets, that you have to choose one. Yeah. You can be frank about how bad things are, or you can be hopeful about how good things are, but you have to choose one. Yeah. And I say, no, they intersect. That's right. That you can actually stand on the corner and say, no, listen. It's actually my honesty digging that ditch really, really low that gives me the ability to build a hope that stands and can withstand the greatest trials. And it's a lesson that I never would have chosen for myself. And it's a ministry that I never would have chosen for myself. So even on this side of things, there's a very real part of me that's like, all of that stuff is great, but I would have been very content to listen to somebody else tell me, and for me to learn vicariously through them. And yeah.
Man. Yeah. John, I mean, I'm blown away, man. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, man.
I just, for everyone that I get an opportunity to talk to about their tragic story, I hate that they've walked through it, but man, I'm so encouraged by what the Lord is doing in you and through you, and the impact you're making because of it. Yeah. And, each one of our stories have this moment where we could go one way or the other, right?
Right.
It's a very critical crossroads type moment. And and we all kind of stand at that precipice going, I could very easily see myself going that way.
Yeah.
Which gives us empathy for other people, right? Who have gone that way. We're like, I can totally see that. But man, praise God that you've chosen to lean into this and let the Lord do his work in your life. Yeah. And I can just sense it and tell it that you're already having such a tremendous impact in the kingdom, and you're going to continue to have that impact.
Thank you, man.
Man, thanks for being vulnerable with us and sharing with us. Where can we follow what you're doing? If we want to get more of you and what the journey God has you on, follow all of this, because I know it's not done.
Yeah. So it's funny. Social media lately has been the hardest. Like, I follow people there, but I get so much of the stuff that I don't want to. So I'm trying to curate a place where folks can go. So YouTube, one of the things that we set out to do was we basically put out this 3-part mini doc series on my journey through grief. So you can go to youtube.com/Mr. JAWNO. So, I mean, I'll send you the link. You can leave
we'll put it right here in the show notes for sure.
So YouTube, and it's socials, right? Easy to find, Twitter and IG, but Substack now is the place where I'm like, there's just so much more to these convos that I really want. They need more than 280 character threads. And so I started a weekly newsletter where people can come and tap in. And this summer we'll be going to 7 cities to try to have some of these conversations in person. Right. So you can tap in and check in on all that.
We're in a society right now where everybody wants the sound bite, the quick and the easy and the, and it's like that has its place. But when we're really talking about wrestling with the mysteries of God.
Yeah.
And trying to uncover what's going on in our own pain and our own grief.
Yeah.
There's no way. There's no way you can do sound bites.
No way at all. No, you can't.
I love that you're doing that, man. You're telling stories. You're digging and wrestling, having conversations, and we'll make sure we put that all in the show notes so you guys can check out everything there. And man, John, thanks so much for spending some time with us today and sharing vulnerably with your story.
Thank you, man. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you, brother.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.